The gravel lot outside the county courthouse in Halsey, Nebraska, smelled like dust and diesel. 40-some people stood in a loose half-circle, boots crunching, breath visible in the cold October air, waiting for the auctioneer to get to the last parcel on the list. 80 acres everyone in the county already called the dead field. Cracked earth stretched out behind a sagging fence line. What grass remained was the color of old paper. 3 seasons of failed harvests had emptied the land of anything green, and the previous owner, a man named Garrett Doyle, had walked away from it in bankruptcy rather than plant a 4th losing crop. "Who wants it?" the auctioneer called, almost laughing himself. 80 acres of nothing. Do I hear $50? A big man near the front, Tully Bragg, who ran the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, snorted loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Wouldn't take it as a gift." Then, a woman near the back raised her hand. Verla Jean Holloway, 51 years old, in a canvas jacket gone soft at the elbows and boots that had clearly walked more rows than ribbons. She didn't smile. She didn't perform for the crowd. She simply said, $80, and the auctioneer blinked like he'd misheard a joke. Laughter rippled through the lot. Tully Bragg shook his head and said loud enough for everyone, "She just bought herself a headache." Nobody else bid. The gavel came down. $80 for 80 acres that the whole county had already buried. Verla Jean signed the papers without a word. Nobody in that parking lot knew that 4 years later, soil scientists from 2 universities would drive out to that same field with sample kits and clipboards, trying to understand what she had done to it. Nobody knew yet what she'd seen in that dirt that everyone else had walked past for 3 years. And nobody, not even Verla Jean herself, not fully, understood yet just how much an ordinary woman with patience and an old man's notebook was about to teach an entire farming community about something most of them had quietly forgotten. If you've ever been underestimated, this channel was built for people like you. Subscribe to the Intelligent Farmer Stories and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Because the smartest farmers often look ordinary until the harvest arrives. Verla Jean Holloway had grown up 40 minutes from that auction lot. On a smaller farm, her grandfather, Otho Pruitt, had worked his whole life. Otho never finished high school, but he could tell you the health of a field by kneeling down and smelling a handful of dirt. He taught Verla Jean to do the same before she was 10 years old, to look for earthworms, to notice where rain pooled and where it vanished, to leave certain weeds alone because they're telling you something, girl. You just gotta listen. Her grandmother, Idris Pruitt, kept a garden that never seemed to fail, rotating crops by some internal calendar she never wrote down. Verla Jean's mother had married into farming and learned it the hard way, through bad years and good ones, and had passed on a kind of stubborn patience that Verla Jean carried into her own adult life. Through a marriage that ended, a decade working as a hired hand on other people's land, and years of quietly saving money while everyone assumed she'd eventually give up and move to town. She wasn't loud. She wasn't looking to prove anyone wrong. She just wanted dirt of her own again. The Doyle field had failed for reasons the whole county could recite. Years of heavy synthetic fertilizer that had stripped the soil's natural biology, 2 brutal droughts back to back, and topsoil erosion so bad that windstorms had carried away inches of it in a single season. Agricultural agents who'd inspected the land for the bank had called it non-productive in their reports. Everyone agreed the soil was, for all practical purposes, dead. But on the day before the auction, Verla Jean had walked the field alone, coat collar turned up against a cold wind, saying nothing to anyone, and knelt down in a low corner near the old creek bed. She dug with her bare hands into a patch of ground that still held a little moisture, and pulled something out that made her go very still. She didn't tell anyone what it was, not at the auction, not for a long while after. What Verla Jean understood, and what most of the county had genuinely forgotten, was that soil isn't just dirt. It's a living system. Healthy ground is full of fungi, bacteria, and organic matter that work together to hold water, feed roots, and build structure. Strip that biology away with years of harsh chemicals and bare, exposed ground, and you're left with something that looks like soil, but behaves more like crushed rock. So instead of plowing or spraying anything that first spring, Verla Jean planted cover crops, clover, rye, and daikon radish, not to harvest, but to protect the surface and pull nutrients back up from deep underground. She stopped tilling almost entirely, since every pass of a plow breaks apart the delicate fungal networks that hold soil together. She brought in old manure and compost, slowly, season by season, rebuilding organic matter the way her grandfather had once described compost as feeding the things that feed the plant, not the plant itself. It was slow. It was unglamorous. And for a long time, it looked like nothing was happening at all. Tully Bragg drove past the field often enough to make comments, sometimes slowing his truck just to shake his head out the window. "Still nothing growing on Verla's dirt," he'd say at the feed store, and a few people would chuckle along with him. Her own brother told her she was wasting money she didn't have. A county extension agent stopped by once, looked at her cover crops, and suggested, not unkindly, that she might be better off selling before she sank more into a lost cause. Money got tight. A hailstorm flattened her second cover crop just as it was establishing. Neighbors offered sympathy that sounded a lot like "told you so." There were nights she sat at her kitchen table with the bank statement and Otho's old farming notebook side by side, trying to decide if patience was wisdom or just stubbornness wearing a nicer name. If you're enjoying stories about patience, intelligence, and real farming lessons, subscribe to this channel. By the second autumn, something shifted. Earthworms appeared in numbers nobody had seen on that field in a decade. The soil, once cracked and pale, had started to darken and crumble softly between her fingers, instead of breaking off in dry chunks. After a rainstorm that used to leave the field puddled and runoff streaked, the water simply soaked in. Wildflowers came up along the fence line that hadn't bloomed there in living memory. Sparrows and meadowlarks began nesting in the grass margins she'd left unmowed. Bees showed up, then more of them. Her neighbors still weren't convinced. Most assumed it was luck, or a wet season, or nothing worth mentioning. But Verla Jean kept careful notes, the same way her grandfather once had, and underneath the obvious question of why this is working, an even bigger one was quietly building. What exactly had she found in that field the day before the auction? By the fourth year, word reached the State University's Agricultural Extension Office that an 80-acre plot once condemned as unproductive was now outproducing neighboring fields planted the conventional way. A small team of soil scientists, led by Dr. Adelaide Crane, drove out with sample kits, asking permission to test. What they found surprised even them. Organic matter in Verla Jean's topsoil had more than tripled. Microbial activity, measured in the diversity and density of soil organisms, was dramatically higher than in surrounding farms. Water infiltration rates, the speed at which rain soaked into the ground instead of running off, had improved enough to make the field notably more drought-resilient than its neighbors, even in a dry year. The explanation wasn't mysterious once they laid it out. By avoiding tillage, keeping the ground covered, and feeding the soil's biology rather than just the plants, Verla Jean had allowed the underground fungal networks, what scientists call mycorrhizal, to rebuild themselves, knitting soil particles together and helping roots access nutrients and water far more efficiently. It wasn't a trick. It was patience applied correctly season after season to a system that simply needed time to heal. Word got around the way it does in small farming towns, fast and a little sheepish. Tully Bragg came out himself that fall, walked the rows without saying much, and finally admitted the dirt felt different in his hand than he expected. Some neighbors started asking real questions about cover crops and no-till methods. A few began trying small sections of their own land the same way. Verla Jean never made it about being right. When people apologized for the laughing, she mostly just nodded and talked about earthworms. In the years after, Verla Jean's field became something of a quiet teaching ground, not a tourist attraction, just a plain stretch of ground where other farmers came to walk the rows and ask questions. Her notes, many of them echoing her grandfather Otho's handwriting from decades earlier, were eventually shared with the Extension Office and used in workshops on regenerative soil practices across the county. As Gandhi once said, "To forget how to dig the earth and tend the soil is to forget ourselves." Verla Jean never read that quote until after the scientists came, but she said it matched something she'd always felt without the words for it. George Washington. Carver's reminder that where there is no vision, there is no hope, might as well have been written about that one quiet afternoon. She knelt in the dirt before an auction nobody thought she'd win. Her real harvest was never the corn or the soybeans. It was the soil itself, returned to life, proof that the ground beneath a failed field isn't always dead, only waiting. Some things cannot be forced into growing. They can only be given enough patience to remember how.